He thought denying her a first-class seat was just another routine decision. But within minutes, the entire terminal would fall into a silence no one would forget as Emily Carter stepped into the departure gate of Terminal B, her soft gray dress brushing just below her knees, her worn leather handbag resting lightly against her side, while polished marble floors reflected the movement of sharply dressed travelers rushing past her with rolling suitcases that cost more than most monthly rents, and overhead, the golden signage for first class shimmered under warm lighting, a space designed for exclusivity, for status, for those who belonged. And at first glance, Emily didn't seem to fit any of it as she approached the counter with quiet composure, her eyes steady, her movements unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world while the gate agent, a young man in a crisp navy uniform, barely looked up before saying, "Next," his voice flat, practiced, efficient as Emily gently slid her boarding pass across the counter, and for a brief second, everything paused because the agent's fingers stopped mid-motion when he read the ticket, his brow tightening ever so slightly before his eyes lifted to scan her from head to toe, taking in the simplicity of her appearance, the absence of designer labels, the lack of urgency that defined most first-class passengers, and that subtle pause stretched just long enough to be noticed as a woman in heels nearby slowed her steps, curiosity flickering in her eyes while the agent cleared his throat and forced a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake," he said, his tone shifting, no longer neutral but edged with quiet doubt as Emily tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I don't believe so." And for a moment, there was something in her tone, something grounded, something unshaken that made the agent hesitate, but only for a moment because training, assumptions, and the subtle hierarchy of appearances quickly reasserted themselves as he tapped the screen again, slower this time, then leaned back slightly, his voice just loud enough to carry. "This boarding pass is for first class," as if stating an obvious fact she couldn't possibly understand, and a faint ripple of attention spread through the waiting area, conversation softening, eyes drifting over as Emily simply nodded once, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the counter while the agent's lips pressed into a thin line, already preparing his next words, already deciding the outcome before the situation had even begun, and somewhere in the background, the distant hum of engines and rolling announcements continued, indifferent, unaware that in just a few moments, this quiet exchange would turn into something none of them were prepared for, as the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The agent's smile thinned as he slid the boarding pass back across the counter with two fingers, as if the paper itself carried uncertainty, and this time his voice carried further, sharper, drawing a few more glances from nearby passengers who slowed just enough to watch without appearing obvious, as he said, "First-class passengers typically check in at the priority desk, ma'am," placing subtle emphasis on the last word while Emily's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed in a way that did not match the tension quietly building around her as she replied softly, "I was directed here," and there was no defensiveness in her tone, no irritation, just a simple statement that seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have as he let out a short breath through his nose and tapped his screen again, this time more forcefully, as if the system itself needed to confirm what he had already decided, while a couple standing nearby exchanged a glance, the woman whispering something under her breath as her eyes flicked between Emily's modest dress and the glowing first-class sign above them, and the agent straightened slightly, calling over his shoulder, "Mark, can you take a look at this?" His voice carrying just enough authority to signal that this was no longer routine as a taller man in a tailored blazer approached, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor, his presence immediately shifting the energy at the counter as he offered a brief, practiced smile before glancing at the boarding pass, then at Emily, his eyes lingering a fraction longer than necessary, assessing, measuring, categorizing, and the silence stretched again, heavier this time, before he spoke in a lower, more controlled tone. "Ma'am, there seems to be some confusion with your ticket." And the word confusion hung in the air like a polite disguise for doubt as Emily tilted her head slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the counter, her voice calm, almost reassuring. "What kind of confusion?" And for a brief moment, Mark hesitated, because there was something in her composure that did not align with the situation they were constructing around her, but the presence of watching eyes, the expectations of protocol, and the quiet pressure of maintaining order quickly filled that gap as he offered a tight smile and said, "This section is reserved for premium travelers, and we just need to verify a few details before proceeding." Though the way he said it suggested that verification was merely a formality before denial, as a faint murmur rippled through the small crowd that had begun to form, subtle but undeniable, as if the entire space was leaning in, waiting for the outcome, while Emily remained still, unshaken, her gaze moving briefly across the faces watching her, not with embarrassment, not with defiance, but with a quiet awareness that seemed almost detached from the moment. As she slowly reached into her handbag, not hurried, not defensive, simply deliberate, and placed her phone gently on the counter, the screen dark for now, her hand resting beside it, as if she had all the time in the world, while the agent and the manager exchanged a quick glance, uncertain, because whatever they had expected from her, it was not this calm. And somewhere in the distance, an announcement echoed overhead, boarding for another flight beginning. But here, at this counter, time seemed to narrow, compressing into a single moment that was about to unfold in a way none of them could predict. The phone rested between them like a quiet statement, its black screen reflecting the overhead lights as the agent's eyes flicked down to it, and then back up to Emily, his confidence no longer as steady as before, while Mark crossed his arms slightly, his posture tightening as he leaned in just enough to lower his voice, though not enough to keep others from hearing. "Ma'am, if you cannot provide proper verification, we will have to ask you to step aside so we can continue boarding our premium passengers." And the phrase premium passengers lingered with deliberate weight as a man in a tailored suit behind Emily let out a soft sigh, checking his watch, his impatience adding pressure to the moment, while a woman nearby shifted her designer handbag higher on her shoulder, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and quiet judgment as Emily did not move, her hand still resting calmly beside her phone, her breathing even, her eyes steady in a way that did not match the situation they were trying to impose on her. And then, without a word, she tapped the screen once, the faint glow illuminating her face for a brief second as she scrolled, her movements unhurried, precise, as if she had done this many times before. While the agent exchanged another glance with Mark, uncertainty now creeping into the edges of their authority, because this was not the reaction they were used to. There was no apology, no fluster, no attempt to explain or justify, just silence and control. And then Emily lifted the phone slightly, not toward them, but toward herself, pressing it gently to her ear as the soft ringing tone was barely audible over the ambient noise of the terminal. And for a moment, nothing happened, just the quiet hum of distant announcements and rolling suitcases. And then her lips parted slightly as she spoke, her voice low, calm, almost conversational. "Hi, I am at gate B12. She paused briefly, listening, her expression unchanged. "Yes, there seems to be some confusion about my seat." Another pause, shorter this time, and then a single word, simple, steady, "Okay," before she lowered the phone and placed it back on the counter with the same deliberate calm as before. And the agent frowned slightly, his brows pulling together as he let out a short breath, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, if you are trying to contact someone, you will still need to follow standard procedures," his tone firmer now, though the earlier certainty had softened just enough to be noticeable. While Mark straightened, adjusting his blazer, his voice more direct. "We cannot delay boarding any longer." But even as he said it, something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, because the room was no longer just watching Emily. It was waiting, and the air carried a quiet tension that seemed to stretch with each passing second, as if the space itself knew something they did not. And then, from somewhere beyond the immediate crowd, a sound began to cut through the background noise, not loud, not abrupt, but distinct, the measured rhythm of footsteps approaching across the polished floor, steady, unhurried. And with each step, the subtle murmur around the gate began to fade, conversations trailing off, heads turning almost instinctively toward the source as the agent's voice faltered mid-thought, his attention pulled away, his expression shifting as recognition flickered in his eyes and Mark's posture stiffened beside him, his shoulders drawing back slightly as the presence approaching carried a weight that did not need to announce itself. And in that moment, without a single word spoken, the balance of the entire situation began to tilt. The sound of those footsteps did not rush, did not hesitate. It carried a quiet authority that seemed to part the air itself as a tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit came into view, his presence subtle yet unmistakable, the kind that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. And as he approached, the low murmur that had filled the gate dissolved into an uneasy silence while the agent straightened instinctively, his posture tightening as recognition sharpened across his face, his earlier confidence faltering mid-breath as Mark's expression shifted even faster, his shoulders pulling back, his jaw setting as if bracing for something he could not yet fully name, and the man stopped just a few steps behind Emily, his gaze moving briefly over the scene before settling calmly on her, his voice low, controlled, and steady as he spoke. Emily. And there was no question in it, only quiet acknowledgement as she turned slightly, her expression softening just a fraction, not surprised, not relieved, simply present as if this moment had already been accounted for long before it happened. And then his eyes lifted to the counter, to the agent, to Mark, and the shift was immediate, subtle but absolute, as if the balance of the room had quietly realigned itself without anyone needing to say it out loud while the agent swallowed, his voice catching slightly before he managed, "Sir, we were just handling a situation." But even as he spoke, the words felt smaller, thinner than before as the man stepped forward, closing the distance with calm precision, his gaze steady, unreadable, and for a brief moment, no one spoke, not the passengers, not the staff. Not even the announcements overhead seemed to matter as the silence settled, heavy and complete, and then he reached out, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with quiet certainty, picking up the boarding pass from the counter and glancing at it once before setting it back down with deliberate care as his voice followed, still calm, still measured. What kind of situation requires denying a confirmed seat? And there was no accusation in the words, no raised tone. But something in the way he said it made the question land harder than any confrontation could have as Mark cleared his throat, stepping in quickly, his professional tone returning but edged now with a careful restraint. "We were verifying the ticket, sir, just standard procedure." Though the explanation sounded rehearsed, insufficient even as it left his mouth while the agent nodded slightly beside him, his earlier certainty replaced with a visible hesitation as the man's gaze lingered on them for a second longer, not searching, not questioning, simply observing in a way that made both of them acutely aware of every word they had already spoken and every assumption they had already made. And then, almost as an afterthought, the man adjusted his cuff, a small, precise movement that revealed a subtle detail, a watch that caught the light just long enough for recognition to deepen across the agent's face as his eyes widened slightly, his breath catching again as realization began to form, incomplete but undeniable, and the room held still, every eye drawn to the quiet center of the moment where nothing loud had happened, and yet everything had already begun to change. The recognition did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly across the agent's face like a realization he wished he had reached sooner as his eyes fixed on the man's watch, then moved to his face, searching, confirming, and when it finally settled, his posture shifted completely, the confidence gone, replaced by something far more fragile as he straightened abruptly, his voice catching before he could steady it. "Sir, I did not realize." But the man did not interrupt, did not react. He simply stood there, calm, composed, allowing the weight of the moment to settle on its own as Mark stepped forward quickly, his tone changing just enough to signal urgency beneath professionalism. "We apologize for any misunderstanding. We were simply following protocol." Yet even as he spoke, the words felt hollow, too late, because the silence in the air had already said more than any explanation could undo while Emily remained where she was, her hand resting lightly on the counter, her gaze steady, not on the staff, not on the watching passengers, but on the man beside her, and in that quiet exchange between them, there was no need for clarification, no need for reassurance, only an understanding that seemed to exist beyond the moment itself, as the man finally shifted his attention back to the staff, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a quiet authority that filled the space effortlessly. "Her seat is confirmed," he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement of fact that left no room for interpretation, and the agent nodded quickly, almost too quickly, his hands moving to the keyboard as if correcting something that should never have been questioned in the first place, while Mark forced a tight smile, his eyes flicking briefly toward the small crowd that had gathered, aware now of every witness, every silent judgment forming around them as the man continued, his tone unchanged. "Then why was she asked to step aside?" And that question lingered longer, heavier, because this time, there was no easy answer as Mark opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the explanation he had prepared moments ago no longer fitting the reality unfolding in front of him, while the agent avoided eye contact entirely, focusing on the screen, his fingers moving faster now, almost nervously as he processed the boarding pass again, confirming what had never been in doubt, and around them, the room remained still, passengers who had once watched with casual curiosity now standing quietly, their attention fixed, their earlier assumptions beginning to unravel as the man reached down, gently taking the boarding pass once more, this time handing it directly back to Emily, his movements deliberate, respectful, as if restoring something that had been momentarily taken from her without cause, and when she accepted it, her fingers brushing lightly against his, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not triumphant, not relieved, simply acknowledging what had always been true, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, the man spoke again. "We will not delay her boarding any further." And this time, it was not a suggestion, it was a conclusion as the agent stepped aside immediately, his earlier authority replaced by silent compliance while Mark followed, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral as the path to the first-class gate opened once more, clear, unobstructed, and for a moment, no one moved, not because they could not, but because the silence held them there, a quiet reminder that respect, once denied, does not return without leaving something behind, and in that stillness, the lesson had already begun to take shape. Emily did not rush forward when the path cleared. She did not seize the moment or react to the sudden shift in tone around her. Instead, she stood exactly where she had been, her fingers lightly holding the boarding pass, her posture unchanged as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, while the man beside her remained equally still, his presence steady, grounded, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for everyone watching to feel it, to sit with it, to understand it, as the agent stepped back fully now, his earlier authority gone, replaced by a quiet unease that showed in the way he avoided direct eye contact, while Mark forced another small nod, his voice softer, carefully measured. "Ma'am, you are welcome to board at your convenience." And there was a subtle shift in the words, no longer instructing, no longer directing, but offering, almost apologetic without saying the word itself, as Emily glanced briefly toward the gate, then back at the two men in front of her, her expression calm, unreadable, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might simply walk forward and let the moment pass, let it dissolve into routine, but instead, she paused, her gaze steady, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry. It was never about the seat, and the words landed softly, yet with a weight that filled the space more than any raised voice could have as the agent froze slightly, his hands hovering above the counter, uncertain, while Mark's expression tightened, the meaning settling in before either of them could respond, and Emily did not continue immediately. She did not explain or elaborate. She simply allowed the silence to hold that sentence, to let it settle into the air where everyone could feel it, where it could not be dismissed or redirected, and then she turned slightly, her attention shifting back to the man beside her, and in that brief glance, there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet acknowledgement as he gave the smallest nod in return. His expression unchanged, calm, steady, and without another word, Emily stepped forward, moving toward the first-class entrance with the same unhurried pace she had carried from the beginning, her steps soft against the polished floor as the space parted naturally around her, no longer because of doubt, but because of recognition, while behind her, The agent exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing just enough to reveal the weight of what had just unfolded as he glanced toward Mark. Searching for direction that no longer felt as certain as before, and Mark remained still for a moment, his gaze following Emily as she walked, his jaw set, his posture rigid, aware now that what had happened could not be undone, that the moment had already defined itself in ways that policies and procedures could not correct. As the surrounding passengers began to shift again, movement returning gradually, conversations restarting in quieter tones, but something had changed, subtle yet undeniable, in the way they looked at the counter, at the staff, at each other as the man remained where he was for one final second, his eyes lingering briefly on the two men in front of him, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a quiet clarity that required no further explanation. And then he turned, following Emily toward the gate, his steps measured, unhurried, leaving behind a silence that no announcement could fully break, a silence that carried a lesson no one in that space would easily forget. Inside the jet bridge, the air felt different, quieter, insulated from the noise of the terminal, and yet the weight of what had just happened followed closely behind as Emily walked with the same steady pace, her steps soft against the narrow flooring, her posture relaxed, as if she had simply moved from one ordinary moment to another, while the man beside her matched her rhythm without effort, his presence no longer drawing attention, yet impossible to ignore as a flight attendant stationed near the aircraft door straightened the moment she saw them approaching, her smile immediate, practiced, but this time carrying a hint of genuine attentiveness as her eyes briefly flicked to the man, recognition flashing instantly before she composed herself. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly, stepping slightly aside to guide them forward, her tone respectful, precise as Emily offered a small nod in return, her expression calm, unchanged. And as they stepped into the first-class cabin, the contrast became even more pronounced: wide leather seats, soft ambient lighting, the faint scent of polished wood and fresh linen, creating an atmosphere designed for comfort and exclusivity. While a few seated passengers glanced up briefly, their curiosity subtle but present, their eyes lingering just a fraction longer as Emily moved down the aisle, her gaze forward, unaffected by the attention, as if none of it held any weight at all. And when they reached her seat, she paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the armrest before she turned slightly toward the man beside her, her voice low, almost reflective. "You did not have to come down here." And there was no accusation in her tone, no discomfort, only a quiet observation as he met her gaze, his expression steady, thoughtful. "I was already on my way," he replied simply, and the answer, though brief, carried more meaning than the words themselves as Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, accepting it without question before settling into her seat, her movements unhurried, composed while he remained standing for a moment, his eyes scanning the cabin briefly, not out of suspicion, not out of concern, but with a quiet awareness that seemed habitual, ingrained, before he finally took the seat beside her, adjusting his cuff once more as the faint click of his watch echoed softly in the stillness. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence between them not uncomfortable, not heavy, but familiar, as if words were unnecessary in a space where understanding already existed. And then Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the runway stretched into the distance, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the tarmac as she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost distant. "It happens more often than people think." And this time, there was something different in her tone, not frustration, not anger, but a quiet acknowledgement of a pattern, of moments repeated in different places, under different lights. As the man turned his head slightly, his eyes resting on her, attentive. "And you still stay this calm," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of something he had seen before. As Emily allowed a faint smile to touch her lips, brief, almost imperceptible. "Because reacting would only prove what they already decided," she replied, her words simple, yet carrying a quiet depth that lingered in the space between them. As he studied her for a moment, then nodded once, slowly, as if affirming something unspoken. And outside, the distant hum of engines began to rise, the aircraft preparing for departure. But inside the cabin, The moment remained still, grounded, a quiet reflection of something far greater than a seat assignment, something that had already shifted the course of more than just a single flight. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm as the final passengers took their seats and the overhead bins clicked shut one by one, the soft chimes signaling that boarding was nearly complete, while a flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, her voice calm and composed as she offered pre-departure beverages, her attention lingering just a moment longer when she reached Emily and the man beside her, her tone respectful, almost careful. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" And Emily glanced up briefly, offering a small, polite smile. "Water is fine, thank you." Her voice steady, unassuming, as if she had always belonged in this space, while the man beside her declined with a slight shake of his head, his attention momentarily drawn to the subtle movements of the crew, the quiet efficiency that kept everything in motion, and for a moment, everything seemed to return to normal. The earlier tension dissolving into the routine of flight preparation as seatbelts clicked into place, and the low hum of the aircraft systems filled the background. But beneath that surface calm, something had shifted, something that could not be undone as the same flight attendant returned with a glass of water, placing it gently on Emily's tray table with a quiet, "Here you go," before leaning in just slightly, her voice lowered. "We apologize for any inconvenience earlier." And though the words were soft, they carried the weight of what had happened beyond the cabin doors as Emily met her gaze. For a brief second, her expression calm, her response simple, "Thank you." And that was all. No elaboration, no lingering emotion, just acknowledgement as the attendant straightened and moved on, her composure intact, but her steps just a touch more measured than before. While across the aisle, a man in a dark suit pretended to read his tablet, though his eyes had not moved from the same line in several seconds, his attention clearly elsewhere, his earlier assumptions quietly unraveling as the engines outside began to grow louder, the subtle vibration of the aircraft signaling the transition from stillness to motion. And beside Emily, the man adjusted his seat slightly, his gaze forward, thoughtful, as if considering something beyond the immediate moment before he spoke again, his voice low, measured. Most people would have argued, and Emily's fingers traced lightly along the edge of the glass in front of her, her eyes still on the window where the runway stretched endlessly ahead as she replied. Most people expect to be heard, and there was no bitterness in her tone, no resentment, only a quiet truth that seemed to exist without needing validation. As he turned his head slightly toward her, studying her for a moment before nodding once, slowly, as if confirming something he had long understood but rarely seen expressed so clearly. And then, as the aircraft began to push back from the gate, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, the world outside shifting as the plane aligned itself for departure, and in that subtle movement, the final traces of the earlier scene faded into the background, replaced by the steady forward motion of something inevitable, something that could not be reversed. As Emily leaned back into her seat, her expression calm, her posture relaxed, as if she had already moved beyond the moment entirely. While somewhere behind them, beyond the closed door of the aircraft, conversations would continue, explanations would be made, and decisions would unfold. But here, in this quiet cabin suspended between departure and destination, the silence spoke louder than anything left unsaid, a quiet reminder that some moments do not need to be repeated to be remembered, and some lessons do not need to be spoken to be understood. As the aircraft lifted from the runway and the city below slowly dissolved into a pattern of lights and distant motion, the cabin settled into a calm that felt almost detached from everything left behind. The earlier tension now replaced by a quiet stillness that lingered just beneath the surface, while Emily gazed out the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her expression composed, untouched by the shift that had unfolded at the gate. As the man beside her sat with equal stillness, his hands resting calmly, his gaze forward, as if the moment had already been filed away, understood, resolved without the need for further discussion. And for a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying a quiet clarity that did not need to be filled until finally, without turning, he said softly, "They will review what happened." And the words were simple, matter of fact, not a promise, not a threat, just an acknowledgement of consequence as Emily's eyes remained on the horizon where the last traces of daylight stretched thin across the sky, her voice equally calm when she replied, "They should review why it happens at all." And there was no sharpness in her tone, no accusation, only a quiet truth that seemed to reach beyond the single moment they had just experienced as he turned his head slightly toward her, studying her profile for a second before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, recognizing the depth behind her words as the flight attendant passed by again, her movements smooth, attentive, her earlier composure now carrying a subtle shift, a heightened awareness that extended to every interaction as if the lesson from the gate had followed them into the air while across the cabin. Passengers who had once glanced with casual curiosity now avoided direct eye contact, their attention redirected, their earlier assumptions quietly dissolving into something more reflective as the plane continued its steady climb, the world below fading into darkness, and inside that calm, Emily finally leaned back fully into her seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of a quiet release, as if the weight of the moment had never truly rested on her to begin with. And beside her, the man adjusted slightly, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "You could have said who you were." And this time, Emily turned her head, meeting his gaze with a calm that held no hesitation, no doubt. "That would not have changed how they saw me when I walked up," she said gently, and the simplicity of her answer settled between them, undeniable, complete as he held her gaze for a second longer, then looked forward again, the faintest hint of understanding deepening in his expression while outside. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, open, unchanging, indifferent to status, to perception, to assumptions, and inside the cabin, the quiet continued. Steady, grounded, as if nothing more needed to be said because the truth of the moment had already spoken for itself, and somewhere, far below, in a brightly lit terminal where voices had once risen with quiet judgment, there would be conversations, explanations, perhaps even consequences. But up here, above all of it, only one thing remains certain, that respect, once denied, reveals more about the one who withholds it than the one who receives it. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, the world, if only for a moment, remembered what dignity truly looks like.